So this is the first video in a series on Native Americans and or indigenous people in English-speaking countries, and this one is about Native Americans. So we're going to go back about 10,000 years when the last ice age was still in place, and the water, much more of the ocean, water in the ocean was tied up in continental glaciers in ice, basically on land. As a result, the ocean waters were lower, and so there was land between the eastern part of Russia here and what is today Alaska. And so people would migrate into North America. And that happened from archaeological evidence roughly 15 to 10,000 years ago. Now at the same time, in the Middle East, people were learning to farm, and they were also beginning to domesticate animals, having control over animals, taming animals such as dogs and horses and cows and goats, pigs, sheep, and many others. And part of that process, which people didn't realize at the time, but which we very much know about now, is that these animals, when you live very closely with them, they get sick just like humans do. And what can happen is that that disease can skip from one animal to another. And this happened, and we'll get back to that in a little while. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what the good old-fashioned British Empire. It's the reason we're talking English today, and the reason English is all over the world. And this here are is the British Empire at its height. And as you see, the American colonies here, which would later become the United States after they became independent, and Canada are important in this consequence. So fast forward a couple of 10,000 years, the European city has grown into something like this, a tightly packed area where people live, you know, very close to animals, and not only animals but animal poop. So you had lots of diseases that would jump from animals to people, and other diseases that were caused from bad hygiene. Cholera, diphtheria, smallpox from cows specifically, and many other diseases that were horrible, killed lots of Europeans and people in the Middle East and other places all over the Eurasian continent and Africa. But over 10,000 years, the people who, you know, had this immunity to these diseases were able to survive them, and they did. So even though people died from these diseases in Europe by the thousands, if not millions, they still managed to, you know, have a thriving civilization. And then they came to the Americas. This picture here reminds me that I'm talking about Christopher Columbus. So Columbus's idea was to go to India from Spain by sailing across the ocean, and he calculated the size of the ocean. And I think this picture sums it up, because, yeah, he was bad at math. Anyway, so the Americas were discovered by the Europeans in the 1500s, and in the 1600s the English began settling in the eastern United States. Well, what was then just, you know, the New World. First colony here in Virginia in 1607, and that's not important. The point is, the 1600s, the English start settling. They run into the Indians, which they called them, and they had on and off relationship, an on and off relationship with fighting and friendship and fighting, a lot of fighting. So the movie Pocahontas will basically summarize this for in the simplest possible way. Yeah, picture says it all, really. And one of the consequences of the Europeans coming to the New World was that they brought these diseases that they had gotten used to over the last 10,000 years to the Indians, who had left that part of the world and stayed isolated in America for 10,000 years. And it's important to note that cows and sheep and pigs didn't exist in America at that time. They were native to the Eurasian continent, right? The wild versions that were tamed and made into our modern farm animals didn't exist in America. The horse didn't exist there. And so the diseases that Europeans had and had developed resistance to they didn't exist in America. So when the Indians, Native Americans encountered these diseases, they died. They got them and died. They had zero resistance. And in some places, more than the numbers vary from place to place and tribe to tribe, but in the worst cases, 90% or even entire tribes would die out from disease. And in other places, as many as 50–60%. So we talk about the coronavirus being bad with death rates from 2 to 8%, but this is a world-ending event. 80% of the people in your culture dying, yeah, it's over. And so the white settlers basically discovered a land that was surprisingly open and empty. Now keep in mind, most Native Americans, not all, but most of them were hunter-gatherers, and so hunter-gatherers have smaller populations than farmers because farmers are more effective at producing more food for more people, like 20 times more effective. And the Europeans came by the droves, and the Indians died by the droves from their diseases. And so we talk a lot about how the Indians died from basically being killed by the white European settlers, the English in this case mostly, since we're dealing with the continental United States. But what really killed them was the diseases. All right, so quick summary here. United States becomes independent. The first 13 colonies are right here. And I gotta go back to the territorial map. The English made a deal with the Native Americans that they wouldn't cross this mountain chain here called the Appalachian Mountains, right? And when the Americans became an independent country, they decided, well, we didn't make such a deal, the English did, so we're going to expand. And they did. And so they expanded into Indian territory, and the Indians, as I mentioned, were devastated by diseases and couldn't really effectively fight back, and were pushed into reservations, right? That's basically the 1700s, 1800s word for meaning concentration camp. And their conditions were very often bad. They were often put in the worst land that nobody else wanted. And then once the Americans discovered that, oh, there's coal here, we don't want that, they would just take the land and push the Indians to somewhere else. And then they would discover that new place, oh, there's gold here, let's squeeze the Indians off there. And then finally, oh, there's oil here, let's squeeze the Indians. So the process was, the United States never made a deal with the Indians that they didn't break, pretty much. And that is a shameful chapter in American history, but it is more or less a fact. Worth noting is the Cherokee tribe, which lived in this area here, which became more or less like a mini American Indian society. They integrated and you know, had schools and cities and stuff like that. They were forcibly moved off their land in the 1800s in a horrible process which they called the Trail of Tears, in which they died by the thousands as they were pushed west in a badly organized move, very often giving money to private contractors to make sure that they had things like blankets and food, and the private contractors would take that money and not buy any blankets and food, and nobody would do anything about it because after all they were just Indians, right? So there's a history of horrible racism and maltreatment of the Native American tribes by the United States government and people. Now exceptions of course exist, but from the Indian perspective, I suspect that meeting the Americans was kind of like, well, from their perspective, I would compare them to orcs in Lord of the Rings. Yeah, I forgot one slide. So today the population of Native Americans in the United States is about 3 million. And if you count people who have a mixed race background, then it's about 5 million. Now, interestingly, about numbers from 15 years ago, that number was pretty much half of that. And the reason is more people are registering their Native American background on the census. So the census is a process that the United States does every 10 years where it counts all the people in the country, because each state will send representatives to the House of Representatives in Congress based on how many people live in the state. So they have to count them, and they do that every 10 years. And the amount of people who say they have Native American background has gone up, and the people suspect that the census people and others believe it's connected to the fact that people don't hide their Native American background anymore, that it has become less difficult to be Native American in America in more recent years, that the racism that they faced and the discrimination and other problems has gone down enough so that they're willing to say openly that they now are Native Americans, that they take pride in their background. There may be other reasons as well, but there's about 1% of the population are Native American, and about 1.5% if you count everyone. All right, that's it. Signing off.